Well, I get to kick things off. Hi, I'm Katie. Some of you might have been to our events before from the Behavior Change for Good initiative. This is our second year doing virtual author series events, but there's an exciting change, which is why I brought a baton. It's actually my 6-year-old's magic wand, but shh, don't tell him I borrowed it. So this year we are partnering with Zeitgeist Media, and specifically the amazing Dave Nussbaum, who is the founder and leader of Zeitgeist Media, to bring you these events. And Dave is going to be taking over, which is why I brought a baton. I'm going to pass it to him. Let's see if this works. You ready, Dave? Can you grab it?
I'm gonna try. Here we go.
Whoa!
I moved it quickly so you couldn't tell it was a pen.
That was really good, you guys.
Maybe we could have a magic show as well. We're passing the baton to Dave. He's amazing. He's a PhD psychologist. He runs this incredible organization that helps scientists bring their ideas to a wider audience through op-eds and books. I'll let him say more about Zeitgeist Media. And I'm so excited that one of our amazing team scientists, Cassie McGillner, also a very dear friend, brilliant UCLA professor, is our first guest talking about her incredible book, my favorite book I have read this year, Happier Hour. So I'm going to disappear and leave them to it. But I just wanted to thank them both for doing this and thank all of you for joining us today. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks so much, Katie. Welcome everybody to the fall season of the Behavioral Science Author Series. I really want to start by thanking Katie and Angela and all of BCFG for launching this series and having the faith to pass that baton over to me. Looking forward to hosting. I also want to thank BCFG's Dina Gromet and Alex Lusher for their help getting this started, and to my partner in crime, Isabel Heck, from Zeitgeist Media, all of whom were indispensable with making this happen. Zeitgeist Media, for people who are not familiar, is a nonprofit that Izzy and I started earlier this year, helps psychological behavioral scientists share their research with the public. We'll be putting a newsletter link in our chat if you want to follow us and see what's going on in the world of psychology and how it relates to your life. This fall, we'll be talking to the authors of 3 books. Today, Cassie Holmes. In October, on the 14th, we'll be talking to Dolly Chugh about her new book, A More Just Future. And in November, we'll be talking to Harvard's Max Bazerman about his book, Complicit. So I'm delighted to welcome our first guest, Cassie Holmes. Cassie is a professor of marketing and behavioral decision-making at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. And her book, Happier Hour, recognizes that we can't magically add more hours to our day. And so it helps us find ways to make the most of the time that we do have so that we can lead happy lives. The book is profoundly reflective, and it helps us think about how we choose to lead our lives. And it gives guidance based on scientific evidence on how we might approach the challenge of crafting our lives in a happier way. Very much, I thought, in the spirit of behavior change for good. So there will be time at the end for about 10 or 15 minutes of audience Q&A. So you can put your questions into the Q&A box below, and we'll be monitoring that and using those for the Q&A session. But for now, let me start by welcoming Cassie. It's great to have you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. This is such a fun treat.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's the first time around trying to navigate running a webinar, but I'm really thrilled that you're our first guest.
I mean, you guys really rocked it with passing the baton. So I think anything else from here is just gravy. So we're good.
Hand it to Katie. She'll always figure out ways to make things fun and awesome. So your book opens with a scene, a vignette of you riding on a train, feeling like you just couldn't hack it anymore. There just wasn't enough time to live your life the way you wanted to. And so I wanted to start by you just telling us about that and how it brought you to this book and to where you are today.
Yeah, and it's an experience that I'm sure so many of you guys can relate to. And so it was back when I was on the faculty at Wharton earlier in my career. And there was this one day in particular where it was just crazy, busy, hectic. I had taken the train up to New York to give a talk that day, and then it was back-to-back meetings, and then a colleague dinner, and then I was racing and rushing to catch the train, and I am not a yeller. And as you know, New York City cab drivers already are driving fast, but despite those two things, I was yelling at the cab driver. I'm like, you've got to hurry up. I cannot miss this train. Because it was the very last train that would get me home to my 4-month-old and my husband back in Philly. And I did make the train, but I remember so vividly sitting on the train that night, looking out the window, and as everything was passing by, it was like this dark blur passing by so fast. I was like, I don't know if I can keep up. Just there simply weren't enough hours in the day to do everything that I wanted to do, between the pressures of publishing at work, wanting to be a good parent, wanting to be a good partner, the never-ending pile of chores at home. There weren't enough hours to get it all done, let alone to do any of it well, let alone to enjoy any of it along the way. And feeling just exhausted and overwhelmed, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And what I know now that I was suffering from time poverty, and we can talk about what that is. And on the train though, I was like, the answer is obvious to this problem. And it is that I should quit my job and move to a sunny, slow-paced island somewhere, because then, days sitting on the beach doing nothing, I would surely be happier, right? But that's an empirical question. So it's like, okay, before I quit my dream job, I think it's worth testing. And so we've gone on to test. And so some of my favorite colleagues, Hal Hirschfield and Marissa Sharif, we analyze what is the relationship between the amount of discretionary time people have and their happiness. So we could test, are people happier who have a whole lot more time? And the results we found were actually really interesting. So they were an upside down U shape. So like an arc or a rainbow. So on the one hand, like me on the train that night, like I'm sure so many of you guys can sympathize with, is that in this data set, folks with less than approximately 2 hours of discretionary time in the day were less happy. And that's because they felt stress. However, what was interesting on the other side of the arc, we saw that people were also unhappy. There is such thing as having too much time, and digging into why, what it turns out is that we are driven to be productive. We are averse to being idle. And so when we spend hours upon hours of our days with nothing to show for how we spent those hours, we feel unproductive. And we feel a lacking sense of purpose, and from that, dissatisfaction. And so this is really helpful to answer like me on the train, and like many days, I will also admit, since, of just that crazy running around, where it's like this just notion that if only I quit and had a whole lot more time, then I would be happier. The answer is no. And also what this speaks to is that, except at the extremes, there's actually a pretty wide range in the middle, where there's not a relationship between the amount of time people have and their happiness. And so that points to, okay, it's not about how much time you have, it's how you invest the time you have. Mm-hmm. It's not about being time rich, it's about making your time rich. And so that set me on this course of trying to figure out empirically, how should we be investing our time for greater happiness? How do we spend the hours of our days so at the end of it, we look back, and instead of feeling exhausted and overwhelmed and stressed out, even if we're busy, you feel fulfilled and satisfied, and you're ready for the next day. And so from the research, I then a few years ago, 4 years ago, I was like, there's actually a lot of learnings in this that could very well be applied, and people could, sort of benefit from. There's behavior change for good. That's right there. It's just we need to know what it is. And so I actually pulled these learnings together and developed a course that I've been teaching to our MBAs and our executive MBAs at UCLA, and seeing the positive effects. So loving data. I measure my students before they take the course, their happiness, satisfaction, sense of connection, sense of meaning. Then at the end of the course, measure those things, and seeing that all of those things, people feel happier, more satisfied, a greater sense of meaning, a greater sense of connection from these learnings, and adopting them and applying them, as well as hearing anecdotally from my students how it impacted their life. So then I'm like, oh my gosh, I want more people to learn from this, because not everyone can, there's not enough seats in the classroom. And so that's what propelled me to write Happier Hour, where it is taking these learnings and the assignments that I give my students in the form of exercises in the book, so that readers sort of everywhere can feel more fulfilled in their days and weeks. So that's what drove it. Long answer, I'm sorry.
No, it's a great answer. And I think that one of the ironies of being so busy that like your life is whooshing by you is that you don't have that time to stop and think, well, how could I be doing this differently to make it more sensible and more fulfilling and happier? So I think that just committing to reading the book or taking the class, that gives you a chance to step back and recognize things that are right there at your fingertips. They're not necessarily super difficult to implement.
And that's actually really important. It's not like, I will say that now I am happy and I am fulfilled and not just totally stressed out and overwhelmed. I'm not considering quitting any sort of dimension of my life that I love so much. But it didn't require something as drastic as moving to a desert island, right? Yeah. It is small changes and intentionality. But first, before you're intentional, you have to be informed of like, okay, what are these little changes that I should make? And that's absolutely what Happier Hour is about.
Right. And we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but I do want to get to some. So having at least a couple of hours of discretionary time. So if you don't have that, you might want to think about how to find that. But going to a beach and spending the entire day at the beach indefinitely sounds enticing right now, but probably isn't after a little while.
Yeah, maybe that first day, and I will say personally, it's day 3 of my beach vacation that I'm like, okay, what are we going to do now? But yes, that first day might be quite delectable.
And so you've taken a lot of studied objective measures of how much time people spend on things and what the effect of that is. But you're also making the case in the book that time scarcity is subjective, right? That it's how you're interpreting that time more so than that time itself sometimes. So tell us more about what you mean by that and how that works.
Yeah, so the term that I have been using is time poverty. Which is the acute feeling of having too much to do and not enough time to do it. And there is research like my unhappiness on the train that night and the data with the lower happiness, but you also see it having negative effects in other domains. It makes us less healthy because we don't take the time to exercise. We delay going to the doctor. It makes us less nice because we're less likely to slow down and help others out. It makes us less confident in being able to achieve our goals. And as we noted, it makes us less happy. And so this question of like, okay, what is this thing that's making us feel this way? That's this time poverty. But notice when I defined it, it's the feeling of having too much to do and not enough time to do it. So the too much to do is based off of our expectations of all that we should and could be doing at any moment. And those expectations are subject to influence, in particular by technology, for instance. So our smartphones are super smart and they allow us to do so much at any moment, but in allowing us to do it, I would say messes with our expectations of what we should be doing, because when we can always be checking items off of our to-do list with this phone. Yeah. Even when you're, like having a meal with a loved one. So you're watching your son's soccer game. Like this is time that we get pulled out of because I'm like, oh, I should be doing this. And then there's this notion of all the things we could be doing, because on social media, there's this constant feed of all the amazing moments that people are having, you know, with their friends while you're doing whatever it is you're doing while looking on the phone. And it's not an accurate representation of people's normal lives, but there's definitely FOMO. And so this concept of what we can and should be doing, of course, there's not enough hours in the day to do all of this. Not only are there like watching other people's lives, we can watch any TV show ever. We can like attend concerts. We can all of this on our phones. So of course, we can't do it all. And so there's that expectation part. Then there's also the sort of feeling that you don't have enough time. So it's this sense of limitation, that lack of confidence and feeling constrained. Yeah. And so what's really helpful in recognizing that, so understanding the role of expectations of your list, that is important, that you should, like, there are things then to combat time poverty is like, well, not only just manage your expectations, but choose how you want to spend your time, as opposed to have this like vague notion of everything you can and should be doing at any moment. But also understanding that there's this self-efficacy or confidence that's involved in being able to achieve what you set out to do. And so we find that, so as I mentioned, when people feel that they don't have enough time or they're in a rush, one of the things that goes by the wayside is slowing down to help someone else out, to do nice things for other people. But we actually found in our work that when you do spend time on another person, it actually makes you feel like you have more time. And the reason is because when you've spent time helping another, you realize how much you've accomplished during the time you have. And you're like, holy moly, I can accomplish, if I could accomplish that, I can accomplish that. And so it increases your sense of what you can do, expanding your sense of time, lessening that limitation. And so there is subjectivity to it, and it's good that there's subjectivity to it, because once we understand what are the inputs, we can address those to make us feel more time affluent.
Yeah, the giving away time, I think, really captures it nicely for me, because you have a whole list of things that you can do with that, but it seems totally counterintuitive that spending time on somebody else would suddenly make you feel like you have more time. But it captures that idea that in doing something selfless for somebody else, you recognize, actually, I do have time for these things. Not right. There's limits to that, of course, as you note. You can't, but there
are limits, and this is work that I love. And this was work with Zoe Chance and Mike Norton, where it is important to note that there are limits. So if you end up not only even giving so much time, but sort of all of your time is absorbed by other people and caring for others, such that your actual ability to take care of yourself and the things that you do need to take care of get neglected, then you don't see this effect. So there is a limit. And I think that the way that I find helpful to think about it is when, when those requests are coming in, or it's really the distinction between whether you feel like your time is being taken from you or whether you are giving it. The giving it has the positive effect. When it is getting taken, then that's
which
not good.
Highlights that idea of subjectivity again so much. So in terms of figuring out where to put your time, you've got this story that you tell of the time jar. How do you decide what and how to put things in? So let's hear a little bit about the time jar.
The time jar is such a helpful analogy that I continue to sort of touch back as I am thinking about my time. And what it does is it really highlights the importance of prioritizing time, being proactive in how we spend our time, prioritizing for the things that really matter. So what this analogy, and I actually show this short film the very first day of my class, showing this. And so a professor walks into his classroom, and on the desk, he puts a large clear plastic jar. And then from his bag, he pulls out golf balls and he fills the jar all the way to the top with the golf balls. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students are like nodding their head, yes, it looks full. It's like, nope. And then from the bag, he pulls out pebbles and he pours the pebbles into the jar and they sort of fill around the spaces all the way up to the top. And he asks the students, is the jar full? And the students are like, yes, the jar is full. Like, no, no, no. And then he brings out some sand and he pours the sand into the jar, and the sand fills all the little places in between the pebbles, in between the golf balls, up to the very top. And he's like, is the jar full? And at this point, the students are laughing. They're like, yes, the jar is full. And then one more step, and then he pulls out 2 bottles of beer. He opens one, pours it into the jar. He opens the other, and then goes and perches on the front of the desk. And he explains, and he's like, the jar is the time of your life. The golf balls are all the things that really matter. Those are your friendships, your relationships with your family, your passions. The pebbles are all the other stuff that's part of your life, like your job, your house. The sand is everything else. The sand is all of that stuff that fills your time without you even thinking about it. So for some, it's social media. For others, it is binging on TV. For me, it is my darn inbox. Whatever it is, it's those requests that will just fill your time without you even recognizing it. And what's important to know is that if he had put the sand in the jar first, all of the golf balls would not have fit. And that's to say, if we let our time get filled with sand, it will. And that leaves us no time for the stuff that really does matter to us. And then one of the students was like, Professor, what's the deal with the beer? And he was like, no matter how full your time is, how busy you are, you always have time for a drink with a friend. And I think that's an important point too.
Yeah.
And so what this highlights is just how important it is to identify your golf balls, which we can talk about how do you identify your golf balls, but make sure that once you have your golf balls, prioritize that time, put those into your schedule, and everything else can sit, like there will be sand and then it can go around it, but you want to make sure that you are spending the time on the stuff that matters.
And everybody's got the same size jar, 24 hours, you got to figure out how to put it in. I, as a new host, am struggling with the fact that I only have a few minutes to ask you questions. And so it's almost time to go to Q&A. But I did want to pause, and we'll come back to some of these questions, I'm sure, in the Q&A. But I love the stories about your kids. And there was a couple of them that came out. And I think, for me, watching your kids, and as they grow up, it really does give you those poignant senses of time and how little time there is, and sometimes how much time there is. So you told a couple stories that I'll let you run with, and then we'll shift it to Q&A. One was about not stopping to smell the roses, and then in terms of savoring that time, recognizing how limited it was. The coffee dates that you do with your daughter. So I will hand it over to you, and I'm going to take a look at some of these questions and start queuing them up.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of making that segue is, what are those golf balls? Oftentimes, one way to identify them is actually reflecting back over the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. What are those moments that brought you immense joy? So often, that reflection leads you to be like, it's these really simple moments. And so it's like, I share this story in the book about walking my son to school on beautiful UCLA's campus. So it's had always been our goal to get back to California to raise our kids in sunshine among smiley people. And it was so gorgeous. We would walk through this campus to get him in he was laughing and skipping along. And it was perfect until you included me in the picture, because I was charging ahead and sort of thinking about the meetings that I was getting to and how little time I had and all the to-dos. And then he's like, Mom, hold on. And I was like, we don't have time. Hurry up, Leo. And he's like, Mom, no, look. And I turn around and he had his nose buried in a bush of roses and he was smelling them. And like out of my mouth came the words, "We don't have time to stop and smell the roses." And then when I heard those words come out of my mouth, I was like, I'm like a time and happiness researcher expert. Like I was horrified and mortified. And what I realized is that these simple, perfect moments we're so likely to miss because, well, one is that we are in our heads and we're distracted. So research shows we're distracted almost half of the time. So we're missing half of these potential moments of joy, especially when we're spending it in like these perfect ways. But it also highlights that when we get used to things, we stop noticing. So that was the same walk that we'd done many days. And because it was such an everyday experience, expecting that it would continue to happen every day. So we take it for granted and we don't pay attention. We miss those little moments of joy. One way to make sure that we don't miss those moments of joy is to count how many times left. And there's this exercise that I think is quite poignant in highlighting that these simple moments of joy are in fact precious and we need to pay attention. And so calculating that, so had I known that, actually I went back and calculated what percentage of our total walks in this perfect setting I'd have left. Had I known that we were 20%, only 20% left of these times, I absolutely would have stopped to smell them. I would have noticed the roses too. Maybe I would have even pointed them out to him. But I certainly would have been in that moment with my son. So it's helpful and I think important to recognize just how limited across our life these times are, so that it makes us carve out the time. So it makes us put those golf balls in first, right? And then it also makes us pay attention during those times, so that we aren't missing them.
We right. You can coast through things and not realize that the best parts, right, are happening while you're paying attention to things that don't really matter.
And it's so important, particularly, we started this whole conversation talking about time poverty, like this feeling of oh my God, I don't have time to do all that I want to do. But when we feel that way, when we actually are spending time in ways that we would not have wanted to spend in any other way, it's like this wonderful activity, walking with my son across this beautiful setting. But if we're not paying attention during those times, then we might as well not be spending the time. And so it is lost time. So it's in order to sort of invest our time best for greatest happiness and fulfillment, there's both identifying what are your golf balls, what are those activities that are really worthwhile, prioritizing, putting them into your schedule first, but also when you're spending that time, being totally in it, so that you're not missing out on that time.
My third grader will still hold my hand when we go and walk, and I know that that's got to be ending sometime soon. And
I know,
it just
so
makes
good.
So I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask you some questions here, and I'm going to start with a question from Mahal Strahilovitz. She asks, what is your view on the trend of quiet quitting, doing the bare minimum at work, as a strategy people are using to find more time for activities to make them happier?
Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomenon, and I think the approach that I suggest in terms of spending your time in worthwhile ways, it picks up on activities both within one's professional life as well as outside of one's professional life. And so I actually think that it's important for folks to recognize that, yes, the average American, their days spent working are among their least happy, but they don't have to be. right? And it's bummy when folks are just trying to get through those hours, because if you look at the time spent, it's, you know, it can be up to a third of our sort of waking lives. And so instead of quitting, or instead of the quiet quitting where you just sort of like pull back on how you're investing in the work that you do, I think it's important to recognize, why are you doing the work? What is your purpose? And there's an exercise that I share in Happier Hour, which is the 5 whys exercise. So it asks, you know, what do you do for work? And then why is that important? Why is that? And it has you dig in to identify for yourself, what drives you? What is your purpose? What's your higher order goal? And that's helpful to recognize, because it allows you to see, well, first it allows you to identify, what are those activities or tasks or projects to take on versus not? Like, what is the sand versus not? But also it helps you to recognize that some of the activities that might not feel so fun that are related to your work, once you recognize that they're serving a purpose and in line with your goals, then it makes them feel better. So all to say, I think that folks are recognizing just how important their time is. And I also will say, so I'm sort of a roundabout answer to the question, but I think it's also interesting to know, in line with this behavior, like both the quiet quitting as well as the great resignation before that, is that I used to, like a couple of years ago, I would have to motivate why happiness is important. The last couple of years have taught us that all of us, that our emotional well-being is absolutely important. We see that anxiety rates, depression rates, burnout rates, so as high as they are, we have come to recognize that our emotional well-being, organizations have been forced to recognize that their employees' emotional well-being is something that matters. Also time, right? This pandemic has taught us that our lives are fragile and our hours add up to our days, our years, and our life. And so the combination of this has all led so many to try to figure out, oh my gosh, this precious resource that I have, I need to spend it in ways that are meaningful. And so you see this backlash of folks recognizing that there's a lot of sand in my workday. It's not worth my time. And there are these other things that are absolutely worth my time. So all to say that, and also going back to quitting, particularly for those, if you do identify that your work is in line with your purpose and your goals and is satisfying and fulfilling, is being very clear on what aspects of it, so that you can gain fulfillment from your work hours and not just be trying to get through them.
Yeah, I think that's really critical, and you have a bunch of different ways that you approach that question. That there's no way to spend all your time on exactly what you want at all times. There's going to be things that, right, you have to make a living, you have to do all sorts of things, and this is coming up in a bunch of the questions. And so how do you, accepting that, how do you make the most of that time? How do you make sure you're not wasting those hours, but you're actually using them effectively? I want to come back. There's a few time jar questions, but there was a cultural question about happiness. And so you were just talking about how the pandemic reminded us that that our emotional well-being is important to us. But happiness itself, that I'm going to try to find the questions so that they can ask it for themselves, but I'm paraphrasing here exactly, roughly. For some cultures, happiness isn't necessarily the goal. And so I wanted you to speak to, okay, fine, if it's not happiness, that doesn't mean this doesn't relate.
Yeah, so I mean, the term happiness is quite loaded. And so, and there are sort of cultural differences in what it means and the extent to which people are striving for it. So there again, cultural difference in even what it means. So not my research, but others have found that in Eastern and Western cultures, like even the ideal form of happiness, in one case, it's more sort of this excited, activated, loud, outward happiness. The other is sort of more calm contentment. We actually, in my research, we found that not only are there's cultural difference, but even within our Western culture, that there are age differences. So younger people tend to experience and associate happiness more with that excited, loud, outward happiness. And then as people get older, there's more calm contentment. But I don't want folks to get hung up on the term happy and happiness. And really what I care about is folks' emotional well-being. So what subjective well-being in the literature is also a term that's used, and it's according to you, like, how do you feel? How much joy, how much positive emotion versus negative do you feel in the day-to-day? And then there's also an evaluative component. How satisfied are you with your life overall? Those are very sort of tightly tied, but there are places that they can sort of pull apart and get disentangled. So I'll just say, I don't want folks to get hung up on, like, is this just about like this like frivolous word of happiness, that it does that even matter? What does matter, and which a lot of the book is pointing to, is that sense of satisfaction. Again, it's about looking back on your days, and instead of feeling stressed and exhausted and unhappy and dissatisfied, it's about feeling fulfilled, satisfied, happy, and ready for the next.
So we have time for maybe one more question, so I'll ask three. They're all related to this time jar, so I'm going to kind of wrap them up. There's a few of them that all strike at this same question. It's basically pushing back on the idea of like, okay, I got this time jar, but I got too many golf balls to put into it. It's I can't, how do I prioritize my golf balls? How do I decide which golf balls don't get to go in there? And how do I decide which things aren't really golf balls and which ones are pebbles and sand? And so we're stretching the metaphor here. I think it's not supposed to be in a one-to-one analog with the events of our lives, but I'll let you respond to the limitations of that the time jar is limited, and that how do we decide, and what which is
great questions. And so one, how do you identify what are your golf balls? And so there's an entire sort of chapter, and I think really important and helpful exercise of time tracking. And you are, as you're spending your time, you're writing down what you're doing. On my website, there's a worksheet that you can do, and in the book it's like
the chat.
Very clear instructions for how to do this, as well as when you come out of that activity, rating on a 10-point scale how it made you feel. And with this wonderful personalized data set, you can pull out what are those activities that you got the highest ratings from you. What are those activities that got the lowest? You can also see how much time you spent on them. Also importantly, pulling out the dimensions, the sort of commonalities across your happiest activities or most satisfying activities, as well as the least. And with that data, you can very clearly identify, all right, what are the golf balls? What is the sand? And then there's actually a lot of other, I have like so much I could say to how to identify, because a lot of the book is helping you to identify what does matter. Another approach is actually taking your whole life perspective. So while some folks find it like a somewhat depressing exercise, it's actually really illuminating, is writing your eulogy. Mm-hmm. So projecting forward to the end of your life, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want people to say about you? And in that exercise of writing, basically, it's not an exercise about death. It's absolutely your ideal life. what that highlights to you is what does matter. It highlights your values. It highlights your purpose. And so with that, you can identify what your golf balls are. And yes, our time is limited. That's sort of the point.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do you prioritize among all of these things that really do matter, right? It really matters. I can sort of use myself as an example. It really matters to me that I have a great relationship with my kids. Really matters to me that I have a great relationship with my husband and my friends. It also really matters to me that I get to do the work that I love so much. And yet another analogy that I won't get too much into here, but I share in the book to sort of highlight is taking this mosaic perspective that it's not, of course, in the next hour, you can't do multiple golf balls. In the next week, you might not even be able to. But if you take a step back and look across your time, look across your weeks, look across your months, look across your years, it then becomes not a question of if you do something that matters to you, like if you can put the golf ball in, it's really when. And so then it's like, okay, even taking the week, it's like, it's really important to me that I have that quality time with my kids. That's going to go here. It's really important to me that I have my quality time. It's really important to me that I get to close my office door, log out of, turn off emails so I can actually get the work that I love to do done. And of course, not all of that is going to happen in the next hour. It can happen across your hours. And so I think that that's the answer to that.
Yeah, no, and it does give you that, what you're talking about, this feeling that you can't get everything done. When you zoom out, you can't get everything done today, but you can get everything done, or you can get the most important things done, even if not today. And that's the other thing that I love about the book, is it doesn't tell you do X, Y, Z. This is you need to spend 8 hours doing this and 2 hours doing that. It helps you look at your own life. And make your own choices based on your own values, which I think is great. Thank you so much to you for being here. Thank you for everybody for your questions and for being here. Thank you to BCFG for co-hosting this with us. I want to say to our audience, you're already registered if you register for today for our next interview, which is on October 14th with Dolly Chugh. Her book is A More Just Future. So there will be reminders for that, but when you sign up for one, you sign up for all three. If you'd like to stay updated on the work we're doing at Zeitgeist Media, we'll pop that link into the chat, and it will come in the post event email. Thank you, Cassie. I really, really appreciate you taking your time on this to spend with us. And thanks to everybody for coming. And we'll see you in October.
Yay! Thank you.
Bye.